Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome back to the Drowsy Historian, the channel where bedtime means we tuck you in with plague pits, torture devices, and all the soothing lullabies history forgot to sing. Tonight's story is simple. If you think modern hospital waiting rooms are bad, you wouldn't last 5 minutes, let alone a full day, in a medieval hospital. Forget sterile wards and cheerful nurses in pastel scrubs. Here, your doctor was more likely to hand you a crucifix than a cure. And if you wanted treatment, the first thing they'd ask for wasn't your symptoms, but your sins. So let's step through the creaking wooden doors of a medieval infirmary, where the air smelled faintly of incense and decay, and where the question wasn't, will you get better? But rather, can you die in a state of grace? Hospitals in the Middle Ages were not designed for recovery the way we imagine today. No gleaming machines, no antibiotics, no guarantees. They were half hospice, half monastery, and half social safety net. A system built less to heal your body and more to cleanse your soul before you clocked out permanently. The mathematics of that equation doesn't work, of course, but then again, medieval medicine rarely did. The very structure of a hospital screamed religion. Buildings were often shaped like crosses, not for aesthetics, but so every patient, no matter how feverish or ulcer-ridden, could keep their eyes fixed on an altar during Mass. If you thought a hospital was supposed to give you peace and quiet, you'd be wrong. Between sung prayers, tolling bells, and monks pacing about chanting the office, you'd be trying to sleep in what sounded like a church stuck inside a construction site. And you weren't just a patient. You were part of the congregation, expected to pray daily for the souls of the wealthy benefactors who had bankrolled the building. If you didn't pray, you weren't just a bad patient. You were freeloading off the pious dead. This is where things get particularly grim. Imagine lying half-conscious, racked with fever, and a monk is shaking you awake to recite your Ave Marias. At Canterbury St Andrew's Hospital, the quota was 300 prayers a day. 300. If you were too weak to say them, well, you'd better whisper until your last breath because eternity was waiting and the paperwork wasn't going to file itself. It's a wonder patients died of infection and not sheer exhaustion. But let's talk about admission, because this is where the medieval system shines in its unhelpfulness. From 1215 onward, you couldn't even step foot into a hospital unless you had confessed your sins. Doctors today ask about your medical history. Back then, priests wanted your eternal one. The logic was simple. If depressing, sin caused disease, so why bother treating the body until you had cleaned the soul? To them, pus wasn't just a medical issue, it was a spiritual one, and this wasn't a polite suggestion. No confession, no bed. You could be coughing up blood at the gates of St. Saint Leonard's in York, but if you hadn't cleared your conscience, you'd be left outside with the beggars and stray dogs. And yet, strangely enough, people wanted in. Because for all the discipline and ritual, hospitals offered something few poor people ever experienced: food, shelter, and relative cleanliness. At Sherburn Hospital in Durham, even lepers received fresh bread, meat 3 times a week, and a gallon of beer daily. Yes, you heard that right, a gallon of beer. Because water was too risky, and beer was liquid nutrition. Compare that to starving on the streets, and suddenly, the choice to enter a hospital didn't seem so terrible, even if the price of admission was your dignity and a sore throat from endless prayers. Now, let's inject a bit of criticism, because frankly, this entire setup looks more like a medieval brand deal with God than a healthcare system. The wealthy donated to hospitals, not out of kindness, but to shave time off their stay in purgatory. The sick were props in this arrangement. Professional prayers whose job was to keep benefactors' souls on the fast track to heaven. And the hospitals themselves? They weren't much more than heavily religious welfare centres. Imagine today's healthcare system, but instead of insurance premiums, you paid with genuflections and Hail Marys. Even the architecture betrayed its priorities. The lofty ceilings were designed less for patient comfort and more to chase away miasma, the supposed poisonous air that carried disease. In reality, the open rafters just meant you were cold, uncomfortable, and echoing every cough through a cavernous space. But the theory was noble. Keep the air moving, and maybe you won't catch whatever your bedmate is leaking. Spoiler, you still did. By the way, yes, bedmate. If you were poor, you didn't get a bed to yourself. It sent you. Leonard's in York, patients of the same gender shared mattresses, meaning you were coughing, sweating, and sometimes dying alongside a stranger. Think of it as the original shared healthcare plan, except there was no opt-out clause. To make this less abstract, let's imagine one of our recurring companions, Thomas, a poor traveller stricken with fever after weeks on the road. He staggers into Saint-Saëns. Leonard's, clutching his chest, muttering that he just needs rest. Instead, the first thing he hears is a priest demanding his confession. His head throbs, his body shakes, but he's forced to dredge up every sin from stealing bread as a boy to swearing at his landlord. Only then does he get a bed shared, of course, with another patient who already looks half dead. As Thomas lies down, he's told he must also pray for the soul of Lady Margaret, the wealthy benefactor who paid for the roof over his head. He closes his eyes, perhaps wondering if the lady might have spent her fortune better on actual doctors instead of chapels. And that, history lovers, is the irony of the medieval hospital. For all its pious intentions and chanting monks, it wasn't really about making you well. It was about making you holy, or at least holy enough to die properly. A medieval hospital didn't ask, "How can we save you?" It asked, "How can we use you?" When people picture a medieval hospital, they often imagine a cleaner version of a monastery with a few extra beds, a pious brotherhood tending to the sick, maybe some candlelight and whispered prayers. The truth is, both stranger and less romantic. A medieval hospital was a factory of ritual, a machine powered by prayer and sustained by the bodies of the poor who shuffled through its doors in search of shelter. The so-called patients were not clients in a medical sense, but inmates of a spiritual system, part of a grand cycle where disease was proof of sin and care was measured in bread, beer, and sermons. This alone would make you question whether you could last a single day. But the real ordeal began the moment you tried to survive the rhythm of daily life inside. The morning routine was not about medicine, but about devotion. Patients were woken early for prayers, even if they had spent the night coughing, sweating, or moaning in pain. Sleep was a luxury, and rest was considered secondary to confession. The first light of dawn was not greeted with a physician's visit, but with the sound of bells calling you to Mass, the very walls echoing with hymns designed to cleanse the soul, but offering little to ease the fever. Try to picture it. You're weak, unable to lift your head from the straw-stuffed mattress, yet still expected to join the chorus of Ave Marias. The assumption was simple and cruel. If you could not pray, perhaps you did not deserve to live. Food was another strange blend of generosity and neglect. On paper, medieval hospitals gave their inmates more than the average peasant could dream of. Fresh bread daily, meat several times a week, cheese, vegetables, and above all beer. A gallon of beer per person was not seen as indulgence but necessity, since water was often polluted. The irony, of course, is that while you were being treated for fevers, ulcers, or open sores, the same hospital was handing you enough alcohol daily to dehydrate you further and cloud your judgment. This was less medical care and more controlled substance management disguised as nutrition. For the poor, however, it was paradise. Many entered hospitals not to be cured, but simply to eat. Cleanliness was another obsession, but not in the way we understand it. Linen was washed weekly, utensils daily, patients bathed occasionally, all with the hope of warding off foul air miasma. Doctors and monks believed disease drifted through the air like invisible smoke, carried by bad smells, so they worked tirelessly to keep the wards smelling fresh with incense, herbs, and lofty ceilings that would lift corruption away from the beds below. It was a grand illusion, because while the stench of rot might be hidden by lavender, the bacteria remained. The germ theory of disease was centuries away, and so patients died in rooms that smelled pleasantly of rosemary and mint. One of the great criticisms we can level at the medieval system is that it confused performance with progress. To the outside world, hospitals looked like mighty institutions, crosses carved in stone, altars glowing with candles, painted ceilings filled with saints. Inside, patients were dying with barely a leech or poultice to their name. The rituals looked impressive, the architecture divine, but the survival rate was abysmal. The hospitals succeeded in convincing everyone that something was being done, when in truth most were simply warehouses of slow death. spiritual waiting rooms where the paperwork of the afterlife was being signed. Consider our companion Thomas, still clinging to his place at St. Leonard's. He wakes to find a servant ladling out bread, while a monk reminds him of his obligation to pray for Lady Margaret's soul. His bedmate coughs violently, their sweat soaking into the shared mattress, and Thomas feels his own fever rising. The lofty ceiling above him, meant to carry away poisonous vapours, instead amplifies every groan and wheeze in the ward. He looks around and realises that of the 200 beds here, almost all are filled, the room alive with the chorus of the dying. This is healthcare, medieval style, half hospice, half chapel, and entirely indifferent to whether Thomas survives to see another dawn. The most shocking part is that England lagged behind much of Europe. While Italian hospitals in Florence employed surgeons, pharmacists, and even eye specialists by the 14th century, English hospitals prided themselves on employing women who doubled as nurses, cooks, and laundresses. Their qualifications were maturity and chastity, not medical knowledge. The reasoning was brutally practical. Mature women were less likely to get involved in scandal with male patients, and more likely to handle the endless drudgery of washing linens and preparing meals. In other words, English hospitals were built not on medicine, but on moral management. Florence offered trained surgeons. York offered older women with laundry baskets. You can imagine which system had higher survival rates. And yet, despite all this, demand for hospital beds never waned. The poor flocked to them. Lepers begged to be admitted, and travellers sought their shelter. Why? Because in a world without antibiotics, anesthesia, or even basic public health, the hospital still represented order. It was a place where food was given, prayers were said, and the dying were not left alone. For the medieval mindset, that was enough. To us, it seems pitiful. To them, it was salvation. The great contradiction is that these institutions were both progressive and regressive, forward-thinking in offering structured care, but fatally bound by superstition and ritual. So if you think you could last a day, ask yourself, could you survive the endless prayers, the strict rules, the shared bed, the gallons of weak beer, the incense masking the stench of disease, and the knowledge that you were there not to be cured, but to be sanctified? Thomas, lying on his straw mattress, already knows the answer. He is not in a hospital in the way we understand it. He is in a waiting room for eternity, and the monks will see to it that he dies well, even if he never had a chance to live better. Chapter 2. Confess before you enter. If you thought simply dragging your feverish body through the doors of a medieval hospital was enough of an ordeal, wait until you hear the rules for admission. Modern hospitals ask for your name, your insurance card, maybe your allergies. Medieval hospitals asked for your soul. Literally, the year 1205 cemented the requirement that no patient could be admitted without first confessing their sins, a rule that sounds like a medieval parody of triage. Forget whether you're coughing up blood or shivering with infection. The monks wanted to know if you had ever lied, stolen, or harboured lustful thoughts. Sin was considered the root of sickness, and disease was a divine punishment. So the solution was spiritual bookkeeping. It didn't matter if you needed a poultice. You were going to be interrogated like a penitent thief before anyone handed you a blanket. And these confessions weren't optional murmurs either. They were often detailed, soul-wrenching exercises. Imagine a poor pilgrim stumbling in from the road, feet blistered, stomach empty, half delirious with fever, and instead of being given water, he's pressed to list every moral failing from the past 30 years. The hospital clerics weren't prioritizing survival. They were prioritizing salvation. That should tell you everything you need to know about the system. Bodies were disposable, but souls were investments. The body might rot on the straw mattress, but the soul could be polished and presented to God. If you couldn't make your confession, then why waste a bed on you? Of course, this meant that the hospitals functioned as gatekeepers of morality as much as institutions of care. It was an oddly bureaucratic theology. First, cleanse the spirit. Then, maybe, if time and resources allowed, someone might look at that ulcer on your leg. This turned the entire enterprise of healing into a process of moral accounting. The sick became case studies in divine justice. Walking examples of sin turned into sores. It is no surprise that many medieval physicians spent more time with the Bible than with actual medical texts. Their work was not about experimentation or discovery, but about reinforcing the cosmic order. Disease was God's handwriting, and the physician's job was to read it, not erase it. The irony here is thick. The Church taught that only God could cure illness, yet hospitals became necessary because illness was everywhere, and God, apparently, was a slow worker. In practice, this meant hospitals existed in a strange limbo. They were not supposed to promise cures, but they had to offer enough ritual and routine to satisfy the population that something was being done. Hence the elaborate prayers, the confessions, the endless repetition of hymns. The real medicine was performance, not poultices. It was theatre, and the patients were both actors and audience. Take the daily requirement of prayers, which bordered on the absurd. At some institutions, patients were required to recite hundreds of prayers a day, not for their own health, but for the wealthy patrons who had funded the hospital. This was the cruelest twist of all. You were dying, you were miserable, and you were still expected to earn your keep by praying for the souls of people you would never meet. Hospitals were engines of spiritual labour, powered by the sick. The donors got eternal credit, the monks got moral authority, and the patients got exhaustion layered on top of disease. Nothing says compassionate care like conscripting the half-dead into a prayer factory, and yet the public saw hospitals as merciful institutions. The alternative was worse, dying alone in a ditch or being left to rot on the roadside. So people entered willingly, even eagerly. For the poor, confession was a small price to pay for a roof and food, even if the roof leaked and the food was sometimes more symbolic than nourishing. A loaf of bread and a gallon of wheat beer might not cure consumption, but it beat starvation, and the monks knew this. They built entire systems on the knowledge that desperation will accept almost anything dressed up as salvation. It is here that the role of discipline becomes central. Hospitals were not chaotic spaces of the suffering, but tightly ordered communities. Rules dictated not only how you prayed, but how you behaved, what you ate, when you spoke, even how you slept. Disobedience was not tolerated, even from the sick. In leprosaria, punishment for breaking rules included corporal beatings and diets of bread and water. Imagine being beaten while your body was already falling apart from disease. The cruelty is staggering, but it reveals the mindset. Suffering was to be embraced as purifying, not eased. The hospital was less a place to escape pain than a place to perfect it. Criticism practically writes itself here. The medieval hospital looked grand in its pious language, but functioned like a moral correctional facility. Patients were not treated as humans in crisis, but as sinners on probation. You were being monitored as much for your obedience as for your health, and obedience counted for more. It was, in essence, a system designed to keep the poor in line while flattering the wealthy with the illusion of generosity. The poor were made to pray. The rich were assured of salvation. That was the trade, and the hospital was the middleman. To bring this down from abstraction, imagine again our companion Thomas. Fever still burns through his body, but now, having confessed every sin he can recall, he is placed under the daily regime. Bells wake him for mass before the sun rises. He drags himself upright, head swimming, while monks chant in tones that reverberate through the cold stone halls. His voice cracks as he tries to keep up, not because he believes it will cure him, but because to fail would mark him as ungrateful, even rebellious. His body demands rest, but the hospital demands prayer. He is caught between the needs of the flesh and the requirements of the soul, and neither will compromise. This is why you wouldn't last a day. It's not just the disease, or the lack of medicine, or the terrible hygiene. It's the crushing weight of ritual layered on top of suffering. It's the knowledge that you are less a patient than a penitent, more valuable as a praying voice than as a living body. And in this system, death is not a failure. It is the ultimate success, proof that you endured the pain long enough to earn your place in heaven. In modern hospitals, death is the outcome to avoid. In medieval ones, it was often the goal. If you somehow made it past confession and the barrage of prayers, you still weren't safe. In fact, you were only entering the next stage of medieval hospital life, which was less about medicine and more about control. Hospitals were religious institutions. And like all religious institutions of the Middle Ages, they believed that discipline was as important as devotion. You might have thought you were checking in for care, but you were really signing up for a monastic schedule disguised as charity. Patients were not free to live as they pleased once they entered. They became part of a community with rules that could rival any monasteries. Silence was often enforced, modesty was expected, and obedience was demanded. If you broke these rules, punishment followed, and it wasn't light. Corporal punishment was a regular feature of hospital life. Yes, imagine being beaten for failing to behave in a place where you were already writhing in pain. The logic was twisted. Suffering was seen as purification. So a beating was not cruelty, but a form of spiritual cleansing. Even bread and water diets were used as punishments, as if starving a fever-stricken body was going to make it holier. This was especially true in leprosaria, the hospitals dedicated to those suffering from leprosy. These were among the earliest hospitals established, often outside the city walls, and their rules were strict. Lepers had to take oaths of sobriety, chastity, and obedience before being admitted. They were not simply patients. They were transformed into semi-monastic inmates, and once inside, their lives were regulated down to the smallest detail. Women washed their heads and bodies once a week, special footwear was issued for ulcerated feet, and undergarments were changed with rigid schedules. It sounds caring at first glance, but don't be fooled. This wasn't about compassion as much as it was about maintaining the appearance of order. To medieval minds, filth carried disease through poisonous air, so discipline and cleanliness wasn't kindness. It was survival theatre. The daily reality of leprosy care was harsher than the rules let on. Leprosy, known today as Hansen's disease, caused ulcers, disfigurement, and eventually blindness or loss of limbs. Patients often needed full-time care, but that didn't spare them from punishment if they disobeyed. In Sherburn Hospital, a disobedient leper could be whipped with a rod before being thrown onto a bread and water diet. Think about the cruelty. These were people whose bodies were already betraying them, whose nerves and flesh were breaking down, and still, they were treated like unruly children rather than human beings in agony. It was the medieval mindset distilled. Disease wasn't just a medical problem, it was a moral one, and the sick had to be disciplined into virtue as much as cared for. Yet, there is a dark irony here. Despite the cruelty, these hospitals were often desirable places. Lepers begged to be admitted. They sought out places like Sherburn or Buckland because admission meant food, shelter, and a form of community. A loaf of bread, a gallon of beer, some meat 3 times a week. These were luxuries compared to starving outside the city walls. To us, it looks like institutionalized misery, but to them, it was salvation. The contradiction is striking. The very institutions that punished lepers were also havens, places of relative comfort where the poor sick could at least hope for consistency, even if it came with a rod across the back. And while England treated its lepers like moral test cases, Europe was already experimenting with more professional care. In Florence's Santa Maria Nuova, hospitals employed surgeons, pharmacists, and even specialists like ophthalmologists. Compare that to England's reliance on mature women, chosen not for medical training, but for their presumed lack of sexual temptation, and you see just how far behind the English were. While Italian patients might receive an eye surgery, English patients received a scolding and a sermon. That was the difference between a system built on medicine and one built on morality. But perhaps the cruelest reality of the leprosarium was the ideology that justified it. Lepers were seen as living embodiments of Christ's suffering. Their disease was considered their purgatory on earth, meaning they were closer to God than anyone else. On the surface, this sounds almost reverent, but in practice it reduced them to symbols, not people. Their pain became useful. Their suffering became inspirational. Their bodies became props for sermons. It is one thing to suffer. It is another to have your suffering exploited as a spiritual lesson for others. And that was the real function of the leprosarium, not to cure, but to display. The patients were walking theology, reminders of both sin and redemption, kept in view but always apart. Criticism here is unavoidable. The medieval hospital wasn't built to save you, it was built to use you. If you were healthy, you were expected to work or pray for patrons. If you were sick, Your suffering was reinterpreted as spiritual capital, something that benefactors could spend to shorten their own time in purgatory. The rich gave money, the poor gave pain. The hospital was the exchange where these transactions took place. Charity was never free. It came with the hidden price tag of discipline, obligation, and spiritual exploitation. Take again our poor Thomas, still clutching onto life in St. Leonard's. His fever hasn't broken, and his body aches from the damp straw and the endless groans of his bedmate. He hears a story circulating among the patients that a widow once secured admission to Sherburn as a favour from the king himself. Even the leper houses were so prized that royal intervention was needed for a bed. Thomas realises he is fortunate to have his place, but the irony gnaws at him. Fortunate to share a mattress with a dying stranger. Fortunate to wake every morning to bells that split his skull. Fortunate to be allowed to exhaust himself with prayers, while his lungs struggle to keep breath in his body. It is fortune of the cruelest kind, survival wrapped in misery, yet better than the streets outside. So no, you would not last a day, not because you would die immediately, though that was certainly likely, but because the very structure of the hospital would grind you down. The endless prayers, the rigid discipline, the punishments layered on top of illness, the exploitation of your suffering as someone else's spiritual currency, it would all break you long before the disease finished its work. The medieval hospital was not a sanctuary. It was a paradox, part refuge, part prison, part stage play for salvation. And if you think you could endure it, then perhaps you deserve a bed next to Thomas, whispering Ave Marias through a fever as the bells toll another dawn. Chapter 3. Beds, Beer, and Bread. If there is one thing that separates the medieval hospital from its modern counterpart, it is not simply the lack of antibiotics or sterile gloves, but the very definition of what care meant. To a medieval patient, being cared for didn't mean being healed. It meant being fed, clothed, sheltered, and prayed over until either your strength returned by some miracle or your soul floated off to the next world. The hospital was as much a home for the weary as it was a hospice for the dying, and daily life inside reflected that odd, contradictory purpose. It was less a medical ward and more a communal boarding house with strict religious supervision, where beds were shared, meals were rationed, and survival depended as much on obedience as on luck. The very idea of a bed is a good place to start, because it will disappoint you quickly. In most medieval hospitals, beds were shared by patients of the same gender. At York's St. Leonard's Hospital, which could house hundreds at its peak, a bed was rarely for one person. Instead, you lay shoulder to shoulder with another sick body, sweating, coughing, and moaning into the same foul straw mattress. Privacy was an alien concept. You shared your sleep, your space, your air, and often your disease. And yet this was considered humane compared to the alternative, sleeping in ditches, barns, or filthy huts. It was, in their eyes, comfort. For us, it is a nightmare. Imagine today's infection control specialists touring St. Leonard's. They'd faint before the first ward inspection was over. Meals were both surprisingly generous and deeply ironic. Patients received a loaf of bread every day, meat several times a week, vegetables, cheese, and on days of fasting, substitutes like eggs. But the real staple was beer, a gallon a day, even for the sick. It was weak beer, yes, but still alcoholic, still dehydrating, still the last thing your fever-ravaged body probably needed. Water was unsafe, so beer became the universal solution, handed out in amounts that would put most pubs to shame. In practice, this meant patients spent their days swaying in a haze of mild intoxication, which might explain why so many accepted the harsh rules of the hospital without revolt. If you can't cure the pain, dull it. It was anesthesia by ale, medieval style. But make no mistake, the hospital wasn't a free buffet. Everything came with obligation. You prayed for your benefactors, you obeyed the rules, and you accepted discipline if you broke them. To receive bread was to become part of the bargain. The hospital was not a neutral charity. It was an institution that turned food and shelter into spiritual contracts. And it wasn't just prayers. Patients were often expected to work if they were well enough, tending gardens, washing linens, or helping with animals. A hospital could easily resemble a monastery farm with an infirmary attached, run on the labour of those who had no choice but to contribute. The staff reflected this strange blend of charity and control. In England especially, hospitals did not employ trained physicians or surgeons for centuries. Instead, patients were looked after by mature women housekeepers, cooks, and laundresses whose experience was practical rather than medical. Their maturity was seen as protection against scandal, their skill not measured in healing, but in maintaining order. They managed the food, the washing, the cooking, and the beds. If they tended a wound, it was because they had done so many times before, not because they were trained to do it. England lagged embarrassingly behind continental Europe, where by the 14th century hospitals like Florence's Santa Maria Nuova employed surgeons, pharmacists, and even eye specialists. In England, your infected leg might be wrapped by someone whose main expertise was boiling cabbage, and yet there was a hierarchy even here. Large hospitals had entire armies of staff: bakers, brewers, cooks, laundresses, priests, and servants. St Leonard's alone employed 16 servants, plus bakers and brewers, to keep the flow of bread and beer constant. It was a machine, but one built around ritual rather than medicine. The hospital's chapel was often its centrepiece, its altar visible from every ward, its services filling the air with chant. Medicine was a background whisper. Religion was the loud chorus. Patients might receive herbal remedies from local healers, but the dominant treatment was prayer. It was not the physician's hand that mattered, but the priest's blessing. The irony is that for all this emphasis on ritual and order, disease still ran rampant. Hospitals were not sanitary in the way we imagine. Straw mattresses became breeding grounds for lice and fleas. Shared utensils passed infections from patient to patient. The same hands that prepared food often washed bodies. Cleanliness was defined as keeping away foul smells, miasma, rather than actually removing bacteria. Patients were bathed not to prevent contagion, but to mask the odours of decay. And so the great contradiction repeats itself. Institutions designed to heal often became incubators of further illness. You went in weak, and you might come out weaker, if you came out at all. Still, hospitals were symbols of prestige and devotion. Wealthy patrons displayed their coats of arms in wards, painted on ceilings so patients lying on their backs would remember to pray for them. Anne of Bohemia, wife of Richard II, had hers embossed above the beds in Norwich. Imagine that, lying feverish, staring up at a ceiling decorated not for your comfort, but for your obligation. You were expected to be grateful for the privilege of dying beneath the emblem of someone who could afford to buy their own prayers with your suffering. It was an exchange written in plaster and paint. Let's return to Thomas, our unfortunate traveller lodged in St Leonard's. His fever has not subsided, and he is forced to share a mattress with another man whose cough rattles like a death bell. A servant brings bread and beer, the warm loaf reassuring, the gallon of ale more disorienting than soothing. He is urged again to pray for Lady Margaret, whose patronage secured the ward. He hears the monks chanting, the incense burning, the bells tolling for Mass. His stomach fills, but his body weakens. He realizes that he is being sustained not to be healed, but to fulfill his role in the system, to eat, to pray, to obey, and to die properly. His survival is incidental. His presence is the point. He is both a patient and a resource, and his gratitude is expected regardless of whether he recovers. This is where the medieval hospital reveals its true nature. It was not about outcomes, but appearances. To the outside world, it looked like charity incarnate: beds for the poor, food for the hungry, shelter for the sick. To those inside, it was a place of endless obligation, a system where comfort was rationed and suffering repurposed into prayer. The wealthy purchased prestige, the church maintained control, and the patients provided the labour of the soul. And that is why you would not last a day. Not because you could not endure hunger or fever, but because you would choke on the endless obligations, the suffocating ritual, the hypocrisy of care that was never meant to cure. Daily life inside a medieval hospital was not so much a medical routine as it was a carefully choreographed performance of order, piety, and survival. If modern hospitals revolve around the physician's rounds, the medieval equivalent revolved around bells, prayers, and communal rituals. The rhythm was set by the church, not the body. The sick had to bend themselves into this structure, whether or not their fevered bodies could keep up. It was healthcare by timetable, where the divine clock mattered more than your pulse. The mornings began early, often before dawn, with the first call to prayer. Patients were roused whether they liked it or not. Some were dragged upright, others whispered from their beds, but all were expected to participate. Imagine being woken with a raging fever to chant hymns in a cold, echoing hall. In the logic of the time, your weakness didn't excuse you from worship. It made it more valuable. The suffering voice was the holiest voice, proof that you were offering your pain to God. And so the wards echoed with half-sung prayers, ragged voices trying to keep up with monks who seemed to live in a permanent state of chant. Meals followed, though the timetable varied by institution. What remained consistent was the reliance on bread and beer. Bread was the foundation of medieval diet, filling if not especially nourishing, while beer provided calories and liquid. Hospitals prided themselves on feeding their inmates generously compared to peasant households, but the irony is clear. A diet heavy in bread, cheese and beer was hardly tailored to the sick. For the fevered, the malnourished and the ulcerated, it was fuel that kept them alive, but not necessarily healthier. It was the difference between not starving and recovering. And yet, for many, that was enough. In a world where scarcity defined existence, the hospital table seemed abundant, even if it was never truly curative. Cleanliness was another point of pride, but it was guided by medieval theories of disease rather than reality. Weekly laundry, bathing schedules, and the careful washing of utensils were meant to guard against miasma, the foul air thought to carry illness. Herbs were scattered on floors, incense burned in chapels, and ceilings were designed to be high and vaulted, supposedly to carry corruption upward and away. It was all theatre, designed to create the impression of safety while doing little to prevent contagion. Patients were packed into wards, breathing the same air, coughing into the same shared space, yet told that the height of the ceiling would protect them. It was as if architecture could substitute for science. Music played a surprisingly central role in this ritualized care. Hospitals such as St. Giles in Norwich included sung masses and prayers throughout the day, filling the wards with melody. Physicians studied music as part of their training, believing that rhythm and harmony could regulate the humours of the body, lift the spirits, and perhaps even steady the heartbeat. To us, it sounds quaint, singing away your fever. But to them, it was a legitimate form of therapy. And in fairness, there is something undeniably soothing about music, even if it doesn't cure disease. But here again the criticism is obvious. It was easier to sing at a patient than to heal them. Harmony replaced hygiene, melody replaced medicine, and the sick were lulled into compliance with hymns instead of drugs. The hierarchy of the institution also mattered. Large hospitals like St. Leonard's in York had dozens of staff, from brewers and bakers to servants and laundresses, all working to keep the machine running. This created an illusion of professionalism. The sheer number of people bustling about gave the sense that care was being taken seriously, but the reality was less impressive. Few, if any, of these staff were trained in medicine. Their expertise was in logistics, feeding, cleaning, managing bodies. The actual treatment of disease was secondary, handled either by local healers or left entirely to prayer. A hospital could appear busy, efficient, and even modern, but beneath the surface it was still a religious welfare centre rather than a true medical facility. Consider again the role of benefactors, because it reveals the real engine of these places. Wealthy patrons donated land, money, or goods to hospitals, not out of compassion but out of calculation. Their gifts purchased prayers for their souls, daily recitations offered by the patients whose very survival depended on their generosity. At Canterbury's St. Andrews, patients were required to pray hundreds of times daily for benefactors. At Norwich, Anne of Bohemia's arms stared down from the ceiling, ensuring that gratitude was literally built into the architecture. The patients themselves were transformed into living reminders of charity. They weren't just sick, they were spiritual labourers, repaying their keep with constant devotion. Charity became a transaction, and the poor were its currency. Our unfortunate companion Thomas discovered this truth quickly. His fever still gnawed at him, but he was expected to join in every ritual. He ate his bread, drank his beer, lay on his mattress beside his coughing bedmate, and tried to sleep under the watchful arms of Lady Margaret, painted above his head. He prayed not for himself, but for her, for the salvation of someone whose wealth had paid for his place in the ward. The more he prayed, the more he realized his life here was not about recovery. He was part of an economy, a cog in the wheel of spiritual exchange. His body might have been failing, but his voice, weak, cracked, exhausted, was still valuable as long as it spoke the right words at the right times. This is the paradox of the medieval hospital. It was both a refuge and a prison, both a sanctuary and a stage. It promised care but delivered obligation. It fed the hungry, yes, but fed them with a side order of discipline and duty. It housed the sick, but in conditions that often spread disease further. It prayed for souls, but mostly for the souls of the rich who had bankrolled the chapel ceiling. And it did all of this with a straight face, convinced of its righteousness. To last even a day here, you would need to accept the trade, surrender your body to the routine, surrender your voice to endless prayer, surrender your identity to the institution. You would need to believe that suffering was holy, that obedience was medicine, that survival was secondary to salvation. Most of us today would balk, but to a medieval mind, it was the only system they knew. They did not expect miracles. They expected ritual, order, and perhaps the chance to die well. And that is why, for all their faults, hospitals endured for centuries. They weren't designed to cure. They were designed to keep the machine running. And if you, like Thomas, found yourself within their walls, you learned quickly that survival was not the point. Participation was. Chapter 4. Nurses without training. One of the strangest realities of the medieval hospital was the absence of what we would recognise as professional medical staff. You could search every ward of St Leonard's in York or the Great Hospital in Norwich, and you would not find a physician making daily rounds with charts in hand. Instead, your care fell into the hands of women who had no medical training but were chosen for qualities that sound less like qualifications and more like a moral checklist. They were supposed to be mature, responsible, experienced in household work, and, most importantly, safe from scandal. Medicine was never the priority. Management, modesty, and moral order were. The English hospitals of the Middle Ages in particular prided themselves on employing these women. They cooked the meals, cleaned the linens, supervised the wards, and kept the place running. In theory, they were nurses. In practice, they were glorified housekeepers working in the middle of a disease ward. Their experience might include dressing wounds or helping a neighbour through childbirth, but there was no systematic training, no medical textbooks, and certainly no licensing. The medieval nurse's expertise was built on repetition and necessity, not on education. And yet, in the eyes of hospital administrators, this was enough. After all, the true healer was God. The staff were there simply to manage his waiting room. Sarcasm almost writes itself here. The hospital could boast of its staff as dedicated and holy women, but it was essentially running on a skeleton crew of laundresses and cooks. Imagine a hospital today advertising itself as fully staffed because it has 16 servants, 2 bakers, and a brewer on site. That was the reality of St Leonard's, a supposedly grand institution. It could feed hundreds, yes, but healing them was another matter. A patient with a festering wound was more likely to be tended by someone whose main skill was baking bread than by anyone who had ever studied anatomy. It is hard not to laugh at the absurdity, though the laughter curdles when you realise how many lives were lost to the system's incompetence. This deficiency becomes even more damning when you compare England to continental Europe. By the 14th century, Florence's Santa Maria Nuova employed physicians, surgeons, pharmacists, and even an ophthalmologist. Junior doctors trained there before moving into practice. Patients could expect a level of attention that at least acknowledged their physical bodies as worth saving. Meanwhile in England, a sick traveller at St Leonard's was being prayed over by monks and handed a gallon of beer by a nurse whose main qualification was being over 40 and considered sexually unappealing. The contrast is staggering, and it shows just how far behind England lagged in treating hospitals as actual medical institutions. But why this difference? In part, it was ideological. The English system leaned heavily on the idea that sin caused disease, so prayer and confession were the most important treatments. If God chose to cure you, he would do so regardless of what herbs or instruments were applied. The role of the nurse was to keep you comfortable, fed, and morally contained while you waited for divine judgment. Continental hospitals, influenced by both church and civic authorities, were more willing to pay trained staff, treating healthcare as a civic duty rather than a purely spiritual exercise. The English approach reduced hospitals to holding pens for the poor, whereas the Italian model at least flirted with something resembling modern medicine. Of course, this doesn't mean the English nurses were useless. Far from it. They provided the daily labour that kept hospitals alive. They cooked, cleaned, dressed wounds, washed bodies, and even managed patients too weak to move on their own. They were the backbone of hospital life, but the lack of formal medical training meant that their efforts were often reactive rather than curative. They could make you comfortable, but they could not heal you. And in a world where comfort often meant the difference between despair and endurance, that counted for something, even if it didn't save lives. Our companion Thomas quickly learned this truth. When his fever worsened, no surgeon appeared, no physician studied his symptoms. Instead, one of the older women came by with a cloth soaked in herbs, laid it on his forehead, and whispered a prayer. She checked that his bread ration was intact, refilled his cup with beer, and moved on to the next bed. It was kindness, yes, but it was not medicine. Thomas realized that survival here was not about treatment, but about endurance. You endured the fever, endured the prayers, endured the suffocating routine, and if you recovered, it was considered God's will. If you did not, that too was God's will. The nurse had done her part by making sure you didn't starve before your judgment arrived. Criticism is unavoidable here. The medieval hospital was designed to look like an institution of care, but it often functioned more like a moral holding facility. Patients were supervised not for their recovery, but for their behaviour. Nurses were trusted not for their medical insight, but for their maturity and piety. This wasn't healthcare, it was moral management. And while it may have provided food, shelter, and a sense of order in a chaotic world, it did little to challenge the suffering that lay at the heart of disease. The hospital was more interested in controlling bodies than in curing them. The irony is that despite this glaring lack of medical staff, hospitals remained highly respected. They were seen as holy places, extensions of the church's mission. To criticize them openly would be to criticize charity itself, and who wanted to be the one to declare that feeding the poor and housing the sick was somehow flawed. The wealthy benefactors who poured money into these institutions were praised as saints, even if their money was buying prayers more than cures. The public saw the impressive buildings, the orderly rituals, the endless chants, and believed something meaningful was happening inside. And in a sense, something was. It just wasn't healing. So, would you last a day under the care of these medieval nurses? Perhaps, if your illness was mild, if your body was strong, if you were lucky, but if you were truly ill, your chances were slim. The best you could hope for was comfort, food, and a hand to steady you as you prayed yourself into exhaustion. That was the reality of the medieval hospital nurse. She could not save you, but she could keep you alive long enough to confess, repent, and maybe, just maybe, survive. And if not, at least you would die in bed, beneath the painted arms of some wealthy patron, rather than in a ditch. That, to the medieval mind, was the true definition of care. If you were lying in a medieval hospital bed and hoping that someone in authority, a surgeon, a physician, a man with tools and knowledge, might walk through the door, you would be disappointed. In England, hospitals did not employ trained doctors for most of the Middle Ages. The institution itself was considered a place for the poor and the dying, and since physicians served the wealthy, there was no reason for them to enter. If you were rich enough to hire a doctor, he came to your home. Hospitals were for the rest of humanity, and the rest of humanity did not have the luxury of a learned man with scalpels and ointments. They had mature nurses with ladles and cloths. This absence became more glaring when you looked across the Channel. In Florence, by the 14th century, hospitals like Santa Maria Nuova were buzzing with medical professionals. Surgeons stitched wounds, apothecaries mixed remedies, and junior physicians trained under their seniors. There was even specialization. Ophthalmologists cared for the eyes, which is remarkable when you consider that many English patients were still being treated for eye infections with prayers and a dab of holy water. Florence was, in effect, experimenting with something we might call modern medicine, While England seemed determined to keep hospitals as religious welfare centres with no actual medicine at all, critics might ask, why was England so resistant to hiring doctors? The answer lies in the purpose of the hospital itself. These were not medical institutions in the way we define them, but religious houses built to care for souls. Hiring a physician would have shifted the focus toward curing bodies, and that was never the point. Disease was seen as spiritual corruption, not biological misfortune. If you recovered, it was evidence that God had chosen to spare you. If you died, it was evidence that God had called you home. Either way, the physician's role was negligible compared to the priest's. Why spend money on a man of science when a man of scripture could accomplish the same goal with fewer tools? But slowly, painfully, the idea began to change. By the 16th century, the Hospital of the Savoy in London employed both a physician and a surgeon, marking a turning point in English hospitals. It took the wealth of Henry VII to make this happen, which should tell you just how little interest there was in medicine for the masses. For centuries, England watched while Europe advanced, only grudgingly allowing doctors into hospitals when royal money forced the issue. In the meantime, countless poor patients endured care that looked more like housekeeping with hymns than actual treatment. Even when surgeons did appear, their work was brutal. Surgery in the medieval period meant amputation without anesthesia, cauterization with red-hot irons, and the occasional attempt at trepanning, which involved drilling into the skull to release supposed pressure. It was more butchery than medicine, and survival often depended less on the surgeon's skill than on the patient's luck and constitution. Infection was almost guaranteed, and the lack of antibiotics meant that the majority of surgical patients died anyway. You might live long enough to boast that the surgeon had saved your arm, but chances were you would not survive the infection that followed. Hospitals were no safer for surgical patients than they were for anyone else. This highlights a fundamental truth about medieval hospitals. They were never meant to reduce suffering, only to frame it. Pain was holy. Illness was divine punishment. Discipline was purification. Even when trained doctors did arrive, they were working within a system that valued confession over cure. The hospital was still primarily a religious institution. The physician's presence was tolerated, but the priest's authority was supreme. If there was a conflict between the two, it was the man with the cross, not the scalpel, who decided the patient's fate. Our companion Thomas, had he been born in Florence instead of York, might have encountered an actual doctor, someone who could at least attempt to treat his fever with herbs, bleeding, or crude diagnosis of humours. But in England, he had only the company of nurses, servants, and monks. He was prayed over, fed, and cleaned, but no one attempted to understand the mechanics of his disease. His body was a battlefield, but no soldier was fighting for him. Only priests offering spiritual triage while his fever burned hotter. It is no wonder that the mortality rates of medieval hospitals were so high. Survival was incidental, not intentional. And yet, these hospitals survived the centuries, not because they cured, but because they comforted. They filled a social need, housing the unwanted, feeding the poor, and giving structure to the chaos of disease. They were not measured by survival rates, but by their ability to embody charity. The public did not ask whether patients lived or died. They asked whether the hospitals reflected God's mercy and the generosity of their benefactors. By that standard, even the most miserable institutions could be declared successes. Here lies the bitter criticism. The medieval hospital hid its failure to cure behind the mask of piety. Its chants, its incense, its endless prayers were distractions from the fact that little healing was taking place. And yet, this was acceptable, even celebrated, because people were so desperate for any system that offered order. Hospitals became theatres of compassion, stages on which the rich displayed their charity, the poor displayed their suffering, and the church displayed its authority. Everyone played their role. Everyone except the disease, which continued its silent work, indifferent to hymns and chapels. So, would you last a day here, hoping for a surgeon? Probably not. If you were in Florence, you might have a chance at real treatment, though crude and painful. In England, your chances were slimmer. Your nurse would hand you bread and beer, your priest would demand prayers, and your bedmate would cough beside you, sharing his infection with each rattling breath. The surgeon, if he existed at all, was nowhere near your ward. You were not in a place of medicine. You were in a place of ritual, where your survival was a footnote to the story of someone else's salvation, and in that system, the odds were always against you. Chapter 5. The Leper's Fate. If the General Hospital of the Middle Ages was grim, the leprosarium was grimmer still. These were institutions created specifically for people suffering from leprosy, known today as Hansen's disease, though the medieval mind had no such neat classification. To them, it was not a medical condition, but a living symbol of sin and suffering, a disease that marked its victims as both cursed and strangely holy. Lepers were seen as outcasts, yes, but also as walking saints whose torment mirrored Christ's own. It was a bizarre contradiction, feared, shunned, pitied, and revered, all in the same breath, and the hospitals that housed them reflected this uneasy mixture of compassion and cruelty. Most leper houses were placed outside the city walls, not because of strict quarantine policies as we might imagine, but because those were the routes most travelled by pilgrims and merchants. The logic was practical and a little cynical. If lepers were to survive, they needed alms, and what better place to beg than along the busy roads leading into town? It wasn't about isolation so much as exposure to the flow of coins and charity. So these leprosaria stood like halfway houses between the living and the dead, visible reminders to travellers of both divine punishment and divine mercy. Life inside was tightly controlled. Admission was not simply a matter of showing up with lesions. Patients were required to swear oaths of chastity, sobriety, and obedience. In essence, they entered not a hospital but a monastery with skin ulcers. Once admitted, discipline was enforced with an almost military strictness. Disobedience could be punished with corporal beatings, and diets of bread and water were used to correct wayward behaviour. Imagine being whipped while your body was already disintegrating from disease. It was cruelty wrapped in the language of holiness, a system that treated suffering as a resource to be managed, not a condition to be alleviated. And yet, despite this harshness, places in leprosaria were coveted. To be admitted meant regular food, clean clothing, and some measure of dignity in a society that often left the sick to fend for themselves. At Sherborne Hospital in Durham, lepers were provided with a loaf of bread every day, a gallon of beer, and meat 3 times a week. On fasting days, they received eggs, cheese, and vegetables. Linen undergarments were issued for those with ulcerated skin, and footwear was provided for damaged feet. Their heads and bodies were washed weekly, and utensils were scrubbed daily. By the standards of the medieval poor, this was luxury. To our eyes it looks pitiful, but to them it was security. The disease itself was terrifying. Leprosy was a slow, chronic illness that damaged the nerves, leading to loss of sensation, ulcers, collapse of the nose, blindness, and eventually the loss of fingers and toes. In the medieval imagination, this grotesque disfigurement was interpreted as visible proof of sin. But paradoxically, it also elevated the leper as a kind of living martyr. Their pain was thought to be their purgatory on earth, meaning that upon death they would ascend directly to heaven. This belief created a twisted form of admiration. To serve a leper, to feed them or wash their wounds, was to share in their suffering, and thus shorten one's own time in purgatory. Charity here wasn't selfless. It was transactional, a way to bank spiritual credit. This duality meant that lepers were simultaneously segregated and sanctified. They were kept outside the city yet honoured as closer to God. They were punished for disobedience yet praised for embodying Christ's torment. They were feared for their disease but courted for their spiritual value. Few groups in history have been so paradoxically treated, and the leprosaria embodied that contradiction in brick and mortar. They were part hospital, part monastery, part prison, and part shrine. Criticism is easy here because the system reveals its cold logic. Lepers were not admitted because society wanted to heal them. Healing was never on the table. They were admitted because their suffering was useful. Useful for teaching moral lessons, useful for inspiring sermons, useful for providing the wealthy with opportunities for spiritual investment. Even their discipline served a purpose. By forcing lepers to accept their torment with humility, the hospital turned them into living examples of obedience. Their disease became a tool, their bodies reduced to symbols in the church's theatre of suffering. Our companion Thomas, though not a leper himself, would have heard stories of these institutions during his stay in St. Leonard's. Perhaps a fellow patient told him of a cousin who secured a bed in Sherburne, or of the widow Joan Chamber who needed the personal intervention of King Edward II to be admitted. Yes, even royal requests were needed to secure entry because places were so limited. To the poor, it seemed enviable. To us, it seems tragic that being beaten in a leprosarium could be considered fortune. Thomas might have reflected bitterly that his own bed, shared with a coughing stranger in York, was scarcely different in its misery. Only here the disease was fever, not ulcers. The truth is that leprosaria made suffering into spectacle. Lepers were exhibited, consciously or unconsciously, as proof of divine justice and mercy. Their agony reassured the healthy that sin was punished, but also comforted them with the idea that pain was redemptive. It was a living sermon, and the hospitals maintained it carefully. And so, even though they offered food, shelter, and basic care, their deeper function was ideological. They kept the social script intact. Disease was sin, suffering was holy, and the church was the only path through both. Would you last a day in a leprosarium? Possibly not. Not because the food was bad or the rules unbearable though they were, but because the sheer psychological weight of being treated as both cursed and holy would crush you. Imagine being told daily that your body was rotting because of sin, while at the same time being reminded that your pain made you closer to God than anyone else. It was a cruel paradox to live under, one that blurred the line between care and exploitation. And for the medieval mind, this was mercy. To understand what life in a medieval leprosarium was really like, we have to push aside the romantic idea of charity and look at the routines, the discipline, and the relentless symbolism that defined these institutions. A leprosarium was not just a shelter. It was a stage on which suffering was organized and displayed for both practical and spiritual effect. For the leper, this meant their illness was not only their condition, it was their identity, their daily labor, and their ticket into a world that both despised and exalted them. The day began, like in most hospitals, with prayer. Even here, among the visibly disfigured, no one was excused from worship. The bells rang, the priests intoned, and the patients were expected to join in, their cracked voices filling the air. For many lepers, whose faces were scarred and whose breathing was laboured, this was almost impossible. But impossibility was not an excuse. The expectation was that every ounce of remaining strength should be offered to God. If your body failed, your voice had to endure. If your voice failed, your silence was framed as holy acceptance of suffering. Either way, your agony was made useful. Meals followed, and these were both practical and symbolic. Bread, beer, and meat were not just nourishment, but reminders that charity flowed from the wealthy to the poor. Every bite was a transaction, food for prayers, comfort for obedience. At Sherburne Hospital, patients were given meat 3 times a week, which was more than many peasants saw in their lifetime. But this came with strings attached. Gratitude was demanded, and obedience enforced. Those who broke the rules, by speaking out of turn, disobeying orders, or failing to show humility, were punished with bread and water diets or physical beatings. To modern eyes, it seems grotesque, punishing the already suffering. To medieval minds, it made sense. Discipline purified, pain sanctified. Even punishment became part of the cure, though it cured nothing at all. Work was expected, at least for those still physically able. Patients tended gardens, washed clothes, or cared for animals, performing light labour that sustained the community. At first glance, this seems reasonable. After all, work provides dignity. But here it was another form of control. Productivity was demanded, not chosen. The leper's body, weakened and fragile, was still considered a tool to be used until it could no longer function. And when it finally broke, the patient was not relieved of duty, but merely shifted into the category of holy sufferer, someone to be displayed as a living lesson of Christ's torment. Either way, your body was a resource. It produced labour when it could, and inspiration when it could not. The routines of cleanliness tell us much about the mentality of the time. Weekly washing of bodies, special linen for ulcerated skin, footwear for damaged feet. These sound progressive, and in some ways, they were. But the driving force behind these measures was not compassion, so much as fear of miasma, the noxious air thought to spread disease. Keeping patients washed and the wards clean was less about their comfort than about protecting the institution and its staff from the invisible vapours of corruption. Even compassion was filtered through superstition. A washed leper was not just a more comfortable one, but a safer symbol to house within the hospital walls. And let's not forget the constant sermons. Lepers were reminded daily that their disease was their purgatory on earth. They were suffering for their sins, but also for the sins of others. Their agony was proof of divine justice, but also of divine mercy. It was, in effect, weaponized theology. By framing the disease as holy suffering, the hospital transformed misery into virtue. The patient was trapped. If he accepted his fate with humility, he was praised. If he resisted, he was punished. In either case, his pain was validated not as tragedy, but as theology. And so the institution maintained its moral order, converting the grotesque reality of disease into a narrative of holiness. Criticism here is unavoidable, and it stings more than usual. These hospitals took human beings already devastated by illness and made their torment into a commodity. Their pain became someone else's lesson, someone else's prayer, someone else's salvation. They were simultaneously cared for and exploited, shielded from starvation, but stripped of dignity. To call it charity is to miss the point. It was management, it was containment, it was theatre. And like all theatre, the audience, the wider society left reassured, while the actors, the lepers, remained trapped in their roles. Our traveller Thomas, lying feverish in St. Leonard's, might have thought of this as he overheard whispers of the leprosaria. Patients spoke of Sherburn with awe, of the food and the routine, of the way even kings intervened to secure places. He might have wondered if life there was better than sharing a mattress with a coughing stranger. But then he would have heard the rest, the strict vows, the punishments, the sermons that compared lepers to Christ's broken body. He might have shuddered at the thought of being turned into a symbol, of having every sore and ulcer interpreted as divine handwriting. His fever felt cruel enough. To live with leprosy and be told it was holy, that was cruelty dressed as comfort. Would you last a day in a leprosarium? Perhaps you could stomach the bread, the beer, the meagre meat. Perhaps you could endure the discipline, the endless sermons, the forced prayers. But could you endure being turned into a symbol, day after day, until you believed your body was nothing but a message written by God? That is what broke people. Not the disease alone, but the crushing weight of its interpretation. And that is why these hospitals, for all their food and order, were not sanctuaries. They were prisons of meaning, cages where suffering was not only endured, but displayed, polished, and handed back to society as proof of virtue. Chapter 6. Pilgrims, Orphans, and Abandoned Babies. Not every medieval hospital was a place of chronic illness or lifelong confinement. Many were designed for travellers and pilgrims who needed a bed for the night, or a meal to sustain them on their way to a shrine. These institutions looked less like hospitals in the modern sense, and more like hybrid hostels, part inn, part chapel, part almshouse, where the line between medical care and simple charity blurred completely. In theory, they were generous gestures of Christian hospitality, open doors for the weary poor and the faithful. In practice, they were overcrowded, underfunded, and burdened with a population that ranged from the desperately sick to the simply exhausted. It was an odd mix, the half-dead, the very devout, and the thoroughly destitute all crammed into one building under the same cross-shaped roof. The purpose of these hospitals was simple: give temporary shelter, food, and spiritual support. Pilgrims in particular benefited, since medieval Europe was obsessed with the holy journey. To walk to Canterbury, Santiago, or Rome was a chance at indulgence, a way to shorten one's time in purgatory. But the body is not built for endless trudging across muddy roads, and many arrived at these hospitals blistered, malnourished, or feverish. A night's rest, a loaf of bread, and a morning prayer was supposed to set them back on their way. And yet, the reality was harsher. Hospitals could not afford to turn away those who looked too sick to continue. Soon, the pilgrims' hostel became indistinguishable from the pauper's ward, with patients staying far longer than intended, slowly transforming these charitable houses into permanent infirmaries. One of the most famous examples was St. Mary's Spital in London, founded by merchants and run by Augustinian monks. It was one of the largest hospitals in the city, and it developed a special focus on poor pregnant women. Women about to give birth could spend their lying-in period there, sheltered and fed before and after delivery. This was revolutionary in some ways, recognizing the vulnerability of childbirth in a society where 1 in 5 women died giving birth. Yet it was also pragmatic. By gathering pregnant women into one place, the hospital controlled and supervised them, providing charity while reinforcing social order. The women prayed, of course, for the souls of the benefactors who had paid for their beds. Even in childbirth, the spiritual economy had to be honoured. The darker side of these maternity wards was the abandonment of children. Hospitals often became depositories for unwanted infants, especially those born out of wedlock. In Florence, at the Santa Maria della Scala, there was a turning box built into the wall, allowing mothers to deposit their babies anonymously. The child would rotate into the hospital, unseen by those outside. On one level, this was mercy. Better an infant raised by wet nurses in the hospital than left to die on the street. But on another level, it reveals the cruelty of a system that normalized abandonment, creating an institutional pipeline for unwanted children. Many of these infants died young despite the care, their short lives part of the grim statistics of medieval childhood. The hospital became a place not only of healing and shelter, but of surrender. This dual role, part hostel, part orphanage, part infirmary, meant that hospitals were perpetually overstretched. A building might house travellers one week, plague victims the next, orphans the next. Resources were strained, and order was maintained only by rigid discipline. Patients were segregated by gender, often forced to sleep several to a bed, their privacy non-existent. Food was distributed with military precision, prayers enforced as obligations, and departures strictly controlled. A pilgrim might come seeking a night of rest, but leave with lice, fleas, and the beginnings of an infection caught from the man in the next bed. The irony was bitter. The hospital promised renewal, but often delivered new suffering. For the staff, this endless churn of bodies was overwhelming. Servants had to feed, clean, and manage a constantly shifting population, while priests attempted to impose spiritual order on what often looked like chaos. The official line was that hospitals represented Christian charity in its purest form. The reality was closer to a logistical nightmare. They were part inn, part hospice, part madhouse, and part morgue. And yet, they were celebrated as triumphs of piety, proof that the church cared for the weak. One suspects that the wealthy donors cared less about the patients than about the inscriptions of their names on walls and ceilings, reminders that their generosity bought them a visible stake in heaven. Our poor companion Thomas might have seen some of these travellers during his time at St. Leonard's. Pilgrims came and went, coughing beside him at night, whispering prayers in strange accents, leaving in the morning with fresh bread in their bags. He watched a pregnant woman carried in, pale and exhausted, laid on a straw bed while monks chanted prayers for her safe delivery. He saw an abandoned baby swaddled and handed to a wet nurse, another life absorbed into the institution's routine. These sights impressed on him that hospitals were not about healing individuals, but about managing the flow of human misery in bulk. They were factories of charity, processing souls through a system that valued order more than cure. And this is where the criticism must be sharp. The medieval hospital's reputation as a beacon of mercy is deserved in some ways. After all, they did feed, house, and sometimes shelter those who would otherwise perish. But their failures were systemic. They confused charity with medicine, ritual with treatment, and discipline with healing. They housed bodies but rarely saved them. They processed infants, travellers, lepers, and the elderly with the efficiency of a warehouse, yet always under the banner of spiritual salvation. The modern observer cannot help but see them less as sanctuaries and more as holding pens, designed to keep suffering tidy and useful. Would you last a day in such a hospital, where travellers, orphans, and expectant mothers shared space with the dying and the destitute? Perhaps you might eat the bread, drink the beer, and rest for a night. But then the lice would find you, the prayers would exhaust you, and the cries of newborns and the moans of the sick would haunt your sleep. By morning, you would stumble back onto the road, perhaps stronger, perhaps weaker, but certainly not cured. You would have survived the institution, but not because it healed you, only because it fed you and then pushed you back into the world. That was its purpose. not to end suffering, but to cycle it, to manage it, to sanctify it just enough to make it tolerable. And that is why, once again, you would not last. If the medieval hospital functioned as a pilgrim's hostel on one hand, on the other, it became a strange safety net for the most vulnerable members of society: orphans, abandoned infants, and women whose pregnancies had pushed them into desperation. This role was never part of the original design. Hospitals were meant to shelter travellers and care for the poor sick, but as centuries passed, the sheer scale of human need forced them into becoming catch-alls for every kind of misery. A medieval hospital was not only a place of illness, it was a place where lives were deposited, quite literally, into the care of monks, nurses, and servants who were ill-equipped to handle them. Nowhere is this more visible than in the phenomenon of foundling care. In cities like Florence, hospitals such as Santa Maria della Scala introduced turning boxes, wooden contraptions set into the outer walls where mothers could anonymously leave their babies. A mother placed her infant inside, turned the mechanism, and the child rotated into the hospital, unseen. On one level, this system was an act of mercy. It gave desperate women an option other than abandoning their children in the streets or rivers. On another level, it institutionalized abandonment, turning hospitals into factories of orphanhood. The infants were cared for, yes, but they were also branded from birth as wards of charity, destined to grow up in a system that saw them less as children and more as liabilities to be managed. Wet nurses became central to this system. Hospitals employed women to feed the abandoned infants, often nursing multiple babies at once. Mortality rates, however, were appallingly high. In some institutions, the majority of these foundlings did not survive their first year. Malnutrition, infection, and sheer neglect claimed countless young lives. And yet, society considered the hospital system a success because the act of taking in the infants was seen as charity. The fact that many died inside was treated as unavoidable tragedy, not as systemic failure. Here lies the bitter irony. The Church could praise itself for accepting the unwanted while quietly burying the evidence of its inability to save them. Pregnant women fared little better. Hospitals like St Mary's Spital in London offered lying-in wards, where poor women could spend time before and after delivery. This was a remarkable recognition of maternal vulnerability, especially in a time when childbirth claimed the lives of 1 in 5 women. But the care they received was again more ritual than medical. Prayers surrounded the delivery, confessions were demanded, and the outcome was left in God's hands. If the mother died, the hospital might raise the infant until age 7. If both mother and child died, they were buried with the consolation that prayers would be offered for their souls. The institution succeeded in providing structure to tragedy, but it did little to prevent the tragedy itself. For pilgrims and travellers, the experience was just as mixed. A weary wanderer might arrive to find a bed, a loaf of bread, and a mug of beer. For one night he could rest his blistered feet, wash his body, and hear Mass. But the next day he was back on the road, his ailments untreated. Worse still, he might leave carrying lice or fleas picked up from the crowded wards, or the beginnings of an infection passed on by a coughing bedmate. Hospitals meant to restore often spread illness, and yet they were celebrated as sanctuaries. To criticize them would have been to criticize Christian charity itself, which was unthinkable in a world where the Church controlled not only salvation, but also the narrative of morality. Our companion Thomas, still lingering at St Leonard's, saw this revolving door of humanity in stark detail. He watched as weary travellers entered, their eyes bright with relief at the sight of bread and shelter, only to leave the next day with the same fevers and sores. He heard the cries of newborns from the maternity ward, followed by silence, too often the silence of death. He saw abandoned infants passed to wet nurses, their small bodies fragile against the cold stone walls of the institution. Each new arrival was greeted as proof of the hospital's importance, each death folded into its routine. The cycle continued, unquestioned. To Thomas, lying feverish, it was clear hospitals did not heal, they absorbed. They absorbed suffering, processed it, and sent it back into the world with a new coat of piety. Criticism here is essential. These hospitals gave the appearance of solving social problems while merely managing them. They did not cure illness, they contained it. They did not end abandonment, they facilitated it. They did not protect mothers, they consoled their deaths. The system's strength was not in its medical achievements, but in its ability to transform misery into something orderly, something that could be prayed over and sanctified. It was less a solution and more a performance of care. The public saw the performance and applauded. The patients lived, or more often died, inside the script. Would you last a day in such a place, surrounded by orphans, pilgrims, and mothers in childbirth? Perhaps you could. The bread might fill your stomach, the beer might dull your pain, the chants might soothe your weary mind. But beneath it all, you would know the truth. You were part of a system that did not exist to heal you, but to make your suffering useful. That knowledge, heavy as it is, would crush most of us long before the fever or infection ever could. Chapter 7. St. Leonard's of York. If there was ever a medieval hospital that embodied both the ambition and the contradictions of the system, it was St. Leonard's Hospital in York. At its height, it was one of the largest hospitals in northern England, a monumental structure that dominated the city's landscape. It had beds for 200 patients and could accommodate as many as 400 inmates. It housed children, the elderly, the destitute, and the sick. It had its own chapel, its own staff of servants, its own brewers, bakers, and cooks. From the outside, it must have looked like a triumph of Christian charity, a beacon of mercy that stood as evidence of the Church's commitment to care. But step inside, and the illusion quickly frayed. The sheer size of St. Leonard's is worth pausing over. 200 beds sounds impressive, until you remember that each bed was shared, meaning privacy was non-existent and infection spread like wildfire. The hospital's wards were arranged not with medical efficiency, but with liturgical priorities. Chapels and altars were positioned so that patients could see and hear Mass at all times. The architecture itself made the point. This was not a medical institution, it was a spiritual one. The patient's soul, not their body, was the real object of attention. And in this system, spiritual supervision mattered far more than whether your fever broke or your ulcers healed. The staff reflected this duality. On paper, St. Leonard's had an impressive workforce: bakers to prepare bread, brewers to keep the beer flowing, cooks to manage the kitchens, and 16 servants to handle daily needs. This gave the appearance of professionalism. But very few of these people had any medical knowledge. They were logistical workers, not healers. The actual care of patients fell to the same cadre of mature women who acted as nurses, washing bodies, preparing poultices, and keeping wards in order. It was not medicine in any meaningful sense, it was management. Patients were tended like livestock, maintained rather than treated, supervised rather than healed. And yet St. Leonard's was not considered a failure. Far from it. It was celebrated as a jewel of the North, proof that the Church cared for its poor. Wealthy donors lavished it with gifts, and their names and arms were emblazoned on ceilings and walls, so that patients, lying in bed, were forced to remember their benefactors. This was the true purpose of the hospital, not simply to house the poor, but to transform their suffering into gratitude. Every prayer whispered by a sick man in St. Leonard's was another indulgence secured for the soul of some wealthy patron. The system was efficient if you measure efficiency in terms of prayers rather than cures. Daily life in St. Leonard's would have been a cacophony of prayers, bells, coughing, and the shuffling of servants carrying bread and beer. Patients shared beds with strangers, often sleeping in damp straw while vermin scuttled underfoot. Incense masked the smells of disease, but it could not mask the reality of overcrowding. Music might drift from the chapel, thought to regulate the humours and calm the mind, but it was hardly enough to steady the nerves of those who knew they might not leave alive. For Thomas, our companion, lying feverish among this chaos, the grandeur of the building was meaningless. What did he care if the arches soared toward heaven, if his body still shivered in the damp, and his prayers were offered for someone else's salvation rather than his own recovery? The irony is that hospitals, like St. Leonard's, were victims of their own success. Their size and visibility made them indistinguishable from monasteries, and when the Reformation swept across England under Henry VIII, these hospitals were destroyed along with the religious houses. The Church had tied healthcare so tightly to monastic life that when the monasteries fell, so did the hospitals. St. Leonard's, once a mighty institution, was reduced to ruins. York, a bustling medieval city, found itself without a hospital at all for nearly 2 centuries. From the 16th until the 18th century, The destruction revealed the fragility of the system. A hospital that had seemed eternal could vanish overnight, leaving the poor once again without shelter or care. Criticism here is almost too easy. St. Leonard's represented everything both impressive and inadequate about the medieval hospital. It was vast, wealthy, and well-staffed, but its priorities were spiritual rather than medical. It fed the poor and housed the sick, but it did little to cure them. It was funded by the wealthy, but it served primarily to secure their souls, not the health of the patients. And in the end, it was destroyed not because it failed the sick, but because it was tied to a religious order that had outlived its political usefulness. The patients were incidental to the institution's fate, just as they had been incidental to its daily operations. Would you last a day in St. Leonard's? Perhaps you might admire the scale of the place, the soaring ceilings, the busy kitchens, the endless flow of bread and beer. But soon you would notice the coughing bedmate pressed against your side, the endless demands for prayer, the sermons echoing off stone walls while your fever climbed. You would realize that you were less a patient than a participant in a ritual, a cog in a machine that had nothing to do with your healing. And when the Reformation finally arrived, the institution itself collapsed, leaving behind nothing but ruins and memories of prayers long since forgotten. That, in the end, was the fate of St. Leonard's grand in vision, hollow in function, and utterly incapable of saving the very people it claimed to serve. To really understand St. Leonard's, you have to stop seeing it as a hospital in the modern sense, and start seeing it as a medieval city within a city. At its peak, it housed not only the sick but orphans, elderly paupers, widows, and travellers. It had kitchens, breweries, laundries, chapels, dormitories, and even its own cemetery. It was less a medical institution and more a miniature society, designed to manage poverty as much as disease. The poor were not only admitted, they were contained. Once inside, their lives were regulated by rules, bells, and rituals, and every moment of their existence was framed as both service to God and repayment to the wealthy benefactors whose generosity had built the institution. One of the most striking features of St. Leonard's was its children's ward. 23 boys lived there, raised under the institution's care. To outsiders, this looked like an extraordinary act of charity. In a world where child abandonment was common and where orphans often starved or fell into crime, a roof over their heads and food in their bellies seemed miraculous. But charity was never free. The boys were expected to live under strict discipline, their prayers offered daily for patrons, their labour eventually funneled into the hospital's upkeep. They were not just orphans, they were investments. Every prayer they muttered for a wealthy lady's soul was another coin in the spiritual bank of the upper classes. They were trained not for freedom, but for obedience. The daily life of the staff added another layer to this strange ecosystem. Bakers rose early to prepare bread for hundreds. Brewers worked constantly to supply gallons of wheat beer. Cooks managed communal meals, and servants cleaned, carried, and enforced order. The hospital seemed to hum with activity, a medieval machine powered by human labour. But the activity masked the absence of medicine. A visitor might see bustling kitchens, hear chanting in chapels, and watch nurses tending patients, and assume care was being given. In reality, it was routine, not remedy. The system was designed to look alive, even when its patients were dying. Music and prayer filled the air in ways that seem almost surreal to us. Physicians believed music could regulate the humours of the body, so choirs sang daily, their voices echoing in vaulted halls. To modern ears, this sounds more like therapy for the soul than the body, and in a sense that was exactly the point. The hospital aimed to soothe the spirit, not the symptoms. Yet imagine being feverish, weak, and half-starved, forced to listen to endless hymns sung not for you but for the souls of distant benefactors. It would have been a peculiar form of torture disguised as harmony, the medieval equivalent of muzak on loop in the waiting room of eternity. The benefactors themselves were never absent. Their coats of arms adorned ceilings, walls, and furniture. Anne of Bohemia's arms were painted on the ceiling of the great hospital in Norwich, and similar decorations were common at St. Leonard's. Patients lying on their backs, too weak to rise, were forced to stare upward at these reminders of who paid for their beds. The message was clear. Your survival was not the result of community or compassion or medicine. It was the charity of one wealthy patron. and your repayment was prayer, constant and unending. It was a system of spiritual debt, one that never allowed the patient to forget who really benefited from their misery. And then there were the rules. Admission required confession, and daily life required obedience. Break the rules, and discipline followed, even in a place meant for the suffering. Patients were not free to moan, to resist, or even to despair. Their behaviour was monitored as carefully as their health. If they faltered in prayer, if they grumbled about their rations, if they resisted the routine, punishment was not far away. Corporal punishment, restricted diets, or even expulsion were possible. Imagine being cast out of St. Leonard's, sick and destitute, your only sanctuary stripped away because you failed to play your part in the great drama of obedience. The hospital promised care, but only for those who conformed. Thomas, our hapless traveller, discovered this quickly. He had hoped for rest, but rest was elusive. The bells rang constantly, calling him to prayer. His bedmate coughed blood through the night, their shared mattress a swamp of sweat and straw. The food sustained him, but the endless beer left him disoriented. When he closed his eyes, the painted arms of Lady Margaret stared down at him, a constant reminder that his prayers were owed. He began to realise that he was less a patient than a prop, part of a spectacle of charity that enriched everyone but himself. The hospital did not ask whether he would recover. It asked only whether he would obey, pray, and endure. Criticism practically writes itself. St. Leonard's was a marvel of organisation, but a failure of medicine. It succeeded in feeding hundreds, clothing orphans, and housing the poor, but it did so by turning them into spiritual labourers. Its grandeur hid its hollowness. It was destroyed during a Reformation, not because it failed the sick, but because its religious foundations made it politically inconvenient. And when it fell, York was left without a hospital for nearly 2 centuries. A damning indictment of a system that had never been built on sustainable medical care in the first place. Would you last a day in St. Leonard's? You might admire its size, its order, its apparent generosity, but soon the illusions would shatter. The noise, the smells, the lack of privacy, the relentless routine, the constant reminder that your suffering was for someone else's benefit. It would crush you. You would see that the grandeur was skin deep, the charity conditional, the care superficial. You would realise, as Thomas did, that hospitals like St. Leonard's were never really about the sick. They were about the living, the wealthy, and the eternal bookkeeping of souls. Patients were simply the ink in that ledger, consumed by a system that prayed louder than it healed. Chapter 8. The Sounds of Healing. If medieval hospitals had a treatment plan, it wasn't scalpels or potions. It was music, prayer, and the endless battle against bad air. To the medieval mind, harmony and cleanliness weren't optional extras. They were medicine. The body was thought to be governed by humours, those slippery fluids of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. When they were unbalanced, illness followed. Physicians argued that music could nudge those humours back into alignment, calming the heart and lightening the mood. If antibiotics were centuries away, perhaps a hymn could stand in their place. And so the wards echoed with singing, not only from the chapels, but from the very mouths of the sick, who were often expected to participate whether or not they had the breath left to do so. The Hospital of St. Giles in Norwich is a perfect example. Masses were sung throughout the day, prayers recited in unison, chants rising up through vaulted ceilings. The effect must have been impressive. For a traveller stepping in from the noise of the city, the hospital felt like a holy symphony, a place where suffering was wrapped in melody. For the patients, however, the reality was mixed. Imagine trying to sleep through a fever while a choir belts out its 15th chant of the day. Imagine being told that the cure for your infection was not rest or medicine, but rhythm. There's a fine line between healing atmosphere and incessant background noise, and medieval hospitals crossed it daily. Still, the belief in music as medicine was sincere. Physicians of the period studied music as part of their training, convinced that harmony regulated the pulse and restored balance. It was not pure nonsense. Music does soothe the mind, and even today it can lower stress. But in the medieval context, it was loaded with spiritual overtones. A hymn was not simply calming, it was a channel for divine grace. If your fever broke, it was because God heard the chant. If it did not, then God had decided otherwise. Either way, the system was never wrong. This is perhaps the most frustrating part of medieval medicine. It was built on theories that could never fail, because failure was always explained away as God's will. The obsession with air was equally telling. Medieval hospitals were designed with lofty ceilings, open spaces, and elaborate ventilation systems, not because they understood germs, but because they feared miasma-poisonous air. Disease, they believed, spread through foul smells. If a ward stank, it was dangerous. If it smelled of incense and herbs, it was safe. And so the hospital became a perfumed theatre of health. Herbs were scattered on floors, incense burned in chapels, and patients were bathed not to stop infection, but to mask odour. It was an endless effort to manage the atmosphere, to create the illusion of cleanliness through smell and architecture. There is something almost comical about the seriousness with which they took this. You could be coughing up blood in the bed beside me, but as long as the room smelled of rosemary and lavender, the hospital considered the danger contained. Bad air was the enemy, and good smells the cure. One wonders what the patients thought of this when the incense thickened the room and made it harder to breathe. Perhaps they whispered their complaints, only to be told that the suffocating haze was saving them from worse corruption. It is hard not to see this as medieval healthcare's version of spraying air freshener over a rotting carcass. Criticism must be gentle but firm here. These practices were not entirely foolish. They did reduce foul odours, they did create calmer environments, and they did impose a sense of order. But they missed the point. The lofty ceilings and incense distracted from the fact that patients were packed together, sharing beds, utensils, and disease. The music distracted from the lack of medicine. The prayers distracted from the absence of trained doctors. Everything was designed to soothe, not to solve. It was theatre, not treatment. And the tragedy is that most people never questioned it. For Thomas, our traveller still languishing in St. Leonard's, this meant endless sensory assault. He lay sweating in his bed, his body shaking, while chants rose and incense curled around him. His head spun from the smell of herbs, his ears rang with hymns, and his stomach churned with bread and beer. He did not feel cured, he felt trapped in a ritual he barely understood. The nurse came by to remind him of his prayers, the priest to remind him of his sins, the choir to remind him of God's glory. Every sense was overwhelmed, every moment managed, and still the fever clung to him, stubborn and unyielding, untouched by all the harmony and perfume in the world. This is the essence of why you wouldn't last a day. The medieval hospital cared deeply about appearances, about atmosphere, about ritual. It created order from chaos, music from groaning, sweet smells from decay. But beneath it all, disease continued unchecked, gnawing through bodies as surely as ever. The institution succeeded in convincing people that something was being done, and for many, that was enough. But if you entered hoping to be healed, you would leave disappointed. If you left at all, you would discover that melody does not cure ulcers, incense does not kill bacteria, and vaulted ceilings do not stop contagion. They only make the theatre more convincing. The medieval hospital's obsession with ritual and atmosphere is one of its strangest legacies. We often imagine healthcare as a battle against disease, but in the Middle Ages, it was more a battle against disorder. Music, incense, lofty ceilings, and symbolic architecture were weapons in this fight. They did not stop the spread of infection, but they created the impression of control, and perhaps that illusion mattered more than we realize. When survival was uncertain and cures were absent, people clung to order like a lifeline. If nothing else, a hospital could transform chaos into ceremony, turning suffering into something that felt meaningful, even if it was not. Architecture played a starring role in this performance. Hospitals were often built in the shape of a cross, with altars placed so that patients could see the Mass from every bed. The design was deliberate. No one should be allowed to forget the spiritual purpose of their suffering. The building itself became a sermon in stone, reminding patients that their illness was not random, but divinely orchestrated. To die here was to die under the gaze of God, surrounded by holy images, bathed in chants and incense. Medicine was not absent, but it was secondary, overshadowed by the overwhelming weight of religious symbolism. For the staff, this symbolism doubled as a tool of discipline. Patients might have questioned the lack of cures, but the rituals convinced them that their suffering had purpose. A fever was not simply a fever. It was the body's way of participating in divine mystery. An ulcer was not merely infected flesh. It was a mark of sin or a test of faith. The architecture, the music, the incense, all combined to reinforce this narrative until questioning it seemed unthinkable. In this way, hospitals maintained control not through medicine but through meaning. To criticize the system was not just to complain about care, it was to blaspheme. Yet, from our perspective, the flaws are glaring. Take the belief in miasma, the poisonous air thought to spread disease. Hospitals built elaborate drainage systems, piped in fresh water, and scattered herbs to combat foul smells. Some even designed tall windows and ventilation shafts to sweep corruption away. These measures probably did improve cleanliness to some degree, but they missed the real culprits: fleas, bacteria, contaminated food, and poor hygiene. Patients could lie beneath soaring rafters, breathing lavender-scented air, and still die from infections contracted by sharing spoons or mattresses. The architecture distracted from the basic fact that hospitals packed too many bodies into too little space. Music carried the same double-edged quality. It comforted, yes, but it also controlled. The chants gave rhythm to the day, turning patients into a congregation, binding them to the institution's routines. To resist was to isolate yourself not just from the hospital, but from God, and so patients complied, whispering prayers through cracked lips, trying to match the choirs even as they shivered with fever. To them, the sound of music was proof that they were being cared for. To us, it is proof that care had been redefined into something abstract, something more spiritual than physical. The hospital succeeded in convincing people that they were part of a holy community, even as disease slowly consumed them. Thomas, our unfortunate traveller, felt this deeply. He lay in his shared bed, his body heavy with fever, while the choir sang endlessly above him. The vaulted ceiling amplified every note, making the room resonate like a cathedral. The smell of incense stung his nostrils, mixing with the stench of sweat and sickness. For a moment, he almost believed he was in a holy place, his pain sanctified, his soul lifted toward heaven. But then the coughing of his bedmate reminded him of the grim reality. Bodies were failing all around him, prayers or no prayers. He realized that the rituals were not for him. They were for the institution, for the benefactors, for the performance of care. His role was not to recover, but to participate, to add his weak voice to the choir of obedience. This is where the criticism must sharpen. Medieval hospitals created environments that soothed the spirit while neglecting the body. They were built on the belief that survival was secondary to salvation, that appearance mattered more than outcome. And in a sense they succeeded. Patients found comfort, donors found prestige, the church found authority. But beneath the chants and incense, disease still ruled. Mortality was high, recovery rare, and medicine stagnant. The hospital was a theatre of hope, but its stage props could not fight infection. Would you last a day in such a place? Perhaps you would be lulled by the chants, calmed by the incense, impressed by the lofty architecture. For a moment, you might even believe the system worked, but as the hours dragged on, the reality would seep through. The groans, the smells, the dying all around you. The rituals would feel hollow, the architecture oppressive, the music exhausting. You would see that the hospital's beauty was camouflage, a mask covering its inability to heal. And once you saw through that mask, you would understand why survival was never the point. Order was. Ceremony was. Your suffering was part of the script, and your only job was to play your role until the curtain fell. Chapter 9. The Missing Doctors. The medieval hospital was a paradox wrapped in piety. On one hand, it was a symbol of Christian charity, a shining example of society caring for its weakest. On the other, it was a brutal reminder that charity did not mean cure. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the role of the so-called medical professionals, or, to be more accurate, their near-total absence. We like to imagine hospitals staffed by physicians, their robes trailing behind them as they dispense wisdom and treatment. The truth is far less reassuring. For most of the Middle Ages, hospitals were staffed not by doctors but by monks, nuns, and the occasional barber surgeon whose understanding of disease ranged somewhere between astrology and trial and error. In fact, many hospitals in England had no physicians at all. The institutions were designed not for curing, but for housing. The staff was chosen for their piety rather than their medical knowledge, because the logic of the age insisted that salvation mattered more than science. The patient's soul needed tending. The body was already on borrowed time, and so the monks prayed, the nuns offered food and linen, and the doctors, when they appeared at all, were more likely to focus on balancing humours than on cleaning wounds. If you developed an abscess or suffered from a gangrenous leg, your treatment would involve leeches, purgatives, and prayers. Sometimes in that order, sometimes all at once, and almost never with much success. Across the Channel, continental Europe offered glimpses of something closer to what we might recognise as professional medicine. In Italy, Spain, and parts of France, universities began training physicians in the 12th and 13th centuries. Hospitals in major cities sometimes employed these graduates, who brought with them manuscripts filled with theories of Galen, Hippocrates, and Arabic scholars like Avicenna. Their knowledge was impressive for the time, but still shackled by superstition and outdated ideas. A physician could diagnose your fever with eloquence, describe your imbalance of humours with flair, and prescribe a concoction of herbs, animal parts, or minerals that might do absolutely nothing. The ceremony of learning was there, but the actual effectiveness was questionable. And here lies the bitter humour of medieval healthcare. The more educated your doctor, the more elaborate the nonsense. At least the village wise woman might hand you a poultice that soothed pain. The physician, armed with theory and Latin, could confidently prescribe powdered emeralds or ground-up mummy dust. To be poor was to risk neglect. To be rich was to pay handsomely for pseudo-science. One could argue that ignorance was cheaper, and in some cases safer. Hospitals reinforced this inequality. Wealthy patrons might hire physicians to visit their establishments, but the common patient rarely saw them. Instead, care fell to attendants who did what they could with the limited tools at hand: broth for the hungry, straw for the bedding, and prayers for the dying. The result was that hospitals functioned less as places of healing and more as holding stations, halfway houses between the world of the living and the hope of the hereafter. If you walked in with a treatable condition, you might walk out alive, but if your illness was serious, the odds were stacked against you. Consider the statistics we do have, scattered though they are. Mortality rates in medieval hospitals were staggering. Fevers, infections, and epidemics tore through wards unchecked. Doctors, when they appeared, often made matters worse. Bloodletting was a common prescription for everything from headaches to plague, weakening patients already on the brink. Purges and emetics left them dehydrated, vulnerable, and exhausted. The prevailing logic was that sickness was the body's way of expelling corruption. The physician's role was to help it along by draining, bleeding, or poisoning. It was a twisted form of partnership with death, a handshake across the veil, and it usually ended the same way. Yet, despite this grim record, medieval society did not see hospitals as failures. Quite the opposite. They were celebrated as triumphs of faith and charity. Kings, bishops, and wealthy merchants poured money into their construction, not because they expected patients to be cured, but because the hospitals offered spiritual insurance. To fund a hospital was to earn favour with God, to cleanse one's conscience, to leave behind a monument of piety. In this sense, the hospital was less a medical institution than a public relations project for the powerful. Patients were the raw material. Salvation was the product. Criticism, however, lurks beneath the surface. One cannot help but notice how the sick were used as props in this theatre of devotion. Their suffering gave donors an opportunity to perform generosity. Their deaths provided the living with a reminder of mortality and the need for repentance. The hospital was built on their backs, but it was rarely built for their benefit. If we strip away the layers of incense and liturgy, what remains is an institution that succeeded in everything except healing. And here we return to the question, would you last a day in such a place? Imagine lying on your straw mattress, your fever burning, and hearing the distant echo of Latin prayers. A nun brings you a bowl of thin broth, whispers a blessing, and walks away. Hours later, a physician sweeps in, takes your pulse, and declares your humours unbalanced. He prescribes bleeding. You are too weak to resist, and so the ritual continues, blood dripping into a bowl, your strength ebbing with it. Somewhere above you, a benefactor's name is inscribed in stone, celebrated for his generosity. You, the patient, are the anonymous body that makes his piety possible. It is a cruel irony. The hospital, celebrated as a refuge, was often little more than a waiting room for death. Its doctors, trained or untrained, could offer little beyond ceremony. Its staff, pious and well-meaning, lacked the tools to save. Its architecture and music might soothe the soul, but they could not cure the body. And yet society called this mercy. Perhaps it was, in its way. But mercy without medicine is a fragile thing, a comfort that disguises its own emptiness. If there was one thing medieval hospitals did exceptionally well, it was turning themselves into incubators of disaster during times of plague. It is a grim irony of history that the very buildings meant to shelter the sick often became the fastest conveyors of death. Picture the ward, a long, open hall, rows of straw pallets laid close enough that patients could hear each other's wheezing breath. Ventilation was limited, not because they didn't understand airflow, though in fairness they didn't, but because drafts were thought to invite illness rather than prevent it. Curtains between beds? Forget it. The only separation came from the occasional wooden screen or a hanging cloth, neither of which did much to stop a cough laden with bacteria. The result was that one man's fever became 20 men's fever within days, and the hospital became less a sanctuary than a multiplier. When the Black Death arrived in the mid-14th century, hospitals were exposed for what they truly were, theatres of helplessness. Mortality rates soared so high that some establishments refused to admit plague victims altogether, a policy that says more about their confidence in divine protection than any practical concern for health. Others, more charitable or perhaps more desperate, threw open their doors, and the wards filled with bodies. Priests administered last rites faster than doctors could apply their leeches. The rhythm of prayer and death blurred into one continuous chant. And yet, society did not view these failures as proof of incompetence. No, they were interpreted as signs of God's wrath, opportunities for the faithful to show humility. The hospital was not condemned for spreading plague, it was praised for offering spiritual comfort in the middle of apocalypse. Even the staff were not immune, of course. Nuns, monks, attendants, all fell to the same contagions they tried to soothe. Some chronicles describe entire communities of caregivers wiped out within months. This mass death created vacancies that were quickly filled by less experienced replacements, further reducing the level of care. Imagine staggering into a hospital, delirious with fever, and finding that the woman bringing you broth had been a washerwoman last week and a nurse today because all the actual nurses were buried in the churchyard. In another era, this would be malpractice. In the Middle Ages, it was simply how things worked. If the hospitals did contribute anything useful during plagues, it was not in healing, but in record-keeping. Monks and nuns kept meticulous chronicles, documenting the swell of deaths, the symptoms of disease, and the frequency of outbreaks. These records, often couched in pious language, are invaluable to modern historians and epidemiologists. But for the patients who lay dying under their pens, the usefulness was debatable. A man coughing blood did not benefit from knowing he was part of a statistic. He wanted medicine, not a manuscript. Unfortunately, manuscripts were all that medieval medicine had in abundance. There was also the small issue of sanitation, or, more accurately, the lack of it. Waste disposal was primitive. Buckets served as toilets, emptied sporadically, and often too close to wells or kitchens. Fleas and lice ran rampant across patients and bedding alike, making the ward a buffet of vectors for plague and typhus. The idea that cleanliness could prevent disease was centuries away. For the medieval mind, filth was not inherently dangerous. It was simply part of life, and so hospitals, places already thick with the smell of sickness, also carried the stench of waste, sweat, and vermin. To walk into such a ward was not to breathe air, but to inhale contagion. And yet, people lined up to enter because even this was preferable to dying alone in a ditch. Now, if we step back and view this critically, the absurdity becomes almost comedic. Here were institutions designed to show Christian charity, but in practice they became charnel houses. The wealthy elite built hospitals to prove their piety, but the hospitals helped spread the very diseases that terrified the public. And instead of reform, what happened? More donations, more prayers, more endowments for chapels. The logic of the Middle Ages was consistent, if not effective. When medicine fails, double down on God. That was not healthcare. That was theological stubbornness dressed in clerical robes. It is worth remembering, too, that these hospitals existed in a world where medical knowledge was tightly controlled. University-trained physicians guarded their Latin texts like holy relics, ensuring that common folk could not access the information even if they wanted to. Healing was not a shared endeavour. It was a hierarchy. The poor died in public wards, while the wealthy secluded themselves in private chambers, hiring doctors to bleed them in privacy. The hospital, then, was not just a place of medicine, but a mirror of medieval inequality. Your experience depended less on your illness than on your coin purse. And through all of this, criticism did bubble up, even in its own time. Some observers noted that hospitals were overcrowded, that care was inconsistent, that resources were mismanaged. Chronicles contain sharp comments about administrators pocketing funds meant for the poor, or clergy more interested in singing masses than cleaning wounds. Yet these critiques rarely led to reform. The system lumbered on, sustained by tradition and faith, because the alternative, admitting that the hospitals did not work, was too terrifying. If not God's mercy, what else was left? So once again we return to the question, could you survive even a day in such a place during the plague years? Imagine lying on a straw pallet, your neighbour coughing blackened blood inches away. The nun who tends to you wears no protective clothing. She wipes your mouth with the same rag she used on 3 other patients. The food she brings is half spoiled, the water drawn from a bucket buzzing with flies. At night, the groans around you turn to silence, and you realise it is not because people have recovered, but because they have stopped breathing. Dawn comes, and the attendants shuffle in, carrying the dead to carts bound for mass graves. If you are still alive by sunrise, congratulations. You have survived one day in a medieval hospital, but only barely. And yet, history insists on calling these places holy. Holy they may have been, but hospitals as centres of healing? That is revisionist fantasy. The medieval hospital was a crucible, a place where faith and mortality collided, where charity masked incompetence, and where death was more reliable than medicine. It was not a hospital as we understand it, but a monument to endurance, of the sick, of the caregivers, and of a society clinging to hope even as it drowned in pestilence. Chapter 10. To die well. If you thought the plague-ridden wards of medieval hospitals were the pinnacle of human misery, wait until you take a closer look at the daily routines of their patients. Survival was not measured in terms of cure, but in terms of endurance. What was a day like inside one of these institutions? The short answer? Long, smelly, and profoundly disappointing. The longer answer takes a little more unpacking, so let's slip into a straw mattress, ignore the fleas chewing at our ankles, and take the full tour of a day in the medieval hospital. Your morning would begin with prayer, always prayer. The ringing of a bell announced the hour of devotion, and attendants, often monks or nuns, guided patients through collective worship. Never mind that half the patients were too weak to sit upright. Prayer was mandatory. Healing, after all, was understood as a divine gift, not a medical achievement. If your fever broke, it was God's mercy. If you died, it was also God's will. This theological catch-22 ensured that the hospital's reputation could never truly be questioned. You didn't recover? Well, clearly your soul needed saving, not your body. And if you did recover, the hospital would take credit for providing the sacred environment that facilitated it. In modern marketing terms, this is what we'd call a can't-lose strategy. After prayer came food, or what passed for it. Meals were generally provided twice a day, often consisting of thin broth, coarse bread, and sometimes a handful of beans or peas. Meat was rare and considered almost medicinal, reserved for those judged most in need. That phrase usually translated to either wealthy donors or those whose visible suffering made for the best moral display. Imagine lying in bed, your body racked with fever, while the patron saint of charity got a serving of beef stew you could smell but not touch. Criticism of hospital kitchens was not uncommon even in their own time. Chroniclers noted mismanagement of supplies, complaints of spoiled food, and accusations of attendants keeping the best for themselves. Not much has changed. Hospital food is still the butt of jokes today, but in the Middle Ages, the joke came with malnutrition attached. Then there was the matter of hygiene. Bathing, when it happened at all, was considered a luxury. Patients might have their faces and hands wiped with a damp cloth, but full-body washing was rare. Water was believed to weaken the sick, open pores to miasmas, and invite disease. The result? A ward that smelled less like a place of healing and more like a livestock barn. Lice and fleas thrived, wounds festered, and the occasional rat scuttled between pallets in search of crumbs. Surgeons and barbers, when they appeared, added to the spectacle. Picture a man with bloodied hands moving from one patient to the next, with no thought of sterilization. He may wipe his knife on his apron, if you're lucky, before lancing another boil. And yet, no one blinked an eye, because no one had ever conceived of germs. Visitors were allowed in some hospitals, though not for sentimental bedside chats. They came to provide alms, pray for the sick, or simply gawk at the suffering. Hospitals were as much religious institutions as they were medical ones, and charity was a public performance. Wealthy donors strolled through the wards like patrons at an art gallery, their presence ensuring the sick remained suitably grateful. A coin dropped in a donation box might do little for the coughing patient, but it certainly purchased spiritual merit for the donor. The patients themselves often became props in this theatre of piety, their suffering silently reinforcing the lesson that charity was noble and poverty inevitable. Throughout the day, the rhythm of prayer and ritual continued. The canonical hours structured life inside the hospital: matins, lauds, vespers, each marked by another round of chanting, kneeling, or murmured responses. It was relentless. To a devout Christian, this might have been comforting. To a feverish patient, it was probably torture. Imagine trying to sleep off a headache while someone swings incense next to your bed and a choir drones psalms in monotone Latin. It was less a hospital than a monastery with added dysentery. And then came treatment, or, more accurately, interventions. Doctors, when they appeared, often prescribed bloodletting, purgatives, or herbal concoctions. A weak patient might be drained of a pint of blood in the belief that it balanced the humours. Another might be forced to swallow a laxative strong enough to keep them doubled over for hours. There was no concept of dosage or patient safety. Medicine was an experiment in trial, error, and superstition. Patients sometimes prayed for the doctor not to come at all, since his visit often left them worse off than before. Sarcasm aside, there is a tragic truth here. Medieval medicine was so misaligned with reality that doing nothing was often the safer course of action. The staff, for their part, were stretched thin. Nuns carried trays of broth, changed linens when they could, and whispered prayers over the dying. Their devotion was real, but their training was non-existent. Some were praised in chronicles for their compassion, others were condemned for negligence. The line between saintly caregiving and reckless endangerment was thin and often blurred. In an environment where the best tools were faith and guesswork, even the most well-intentioned staff could become harbingers of disaster. Nightfall brought no relief. The wards remained noisy with coughing, groaning, and the shuffle of attendants. Darkness was absolute, broken only by flickering candles. Patients were left to stew in their fevers, their dreams interrupted by the occasional scream of a neighbour racked with pain. Death was so common that its arrival hardly stirred alarm. In some hospitals, the dead were removed under cover of darkness, carried out before dawn to avoid frightening those still alive. But everyone knew. You could hear the carts outside, wheels creaking as they made their grim deliveries to the churchyard. The medieval hospital, in its daily routines, reveals itself as an institution less about healing bodies than about shaping souls. Every prayer, every ritual, every spoonful of broth was aimed at the spiritual, not the physical. The body was temporary, the soul eternal. Criticism of this system is easy now, and rightly so, but it also highlights the terrifying reality of a world without science. Hospitals were built on faith because faith was all they had, and while that faith offered comfort, it did little to cure infection, reset bones, or fight plague. Patients entered hoping for recovery, but more often found themselves rehearsing for death. So, could you survive even a day under this routine? Perhaps, but survival would not be measured in health or strength. It would be measured in your tolerance for monotony, prayer, hunger, filth, and the constant reminder that you were less a patient than a soul on probation. In a sense, medieval hospitals were brutally honest. They never promised what they could not deliver. Healing was out of their hands. Endurance was the only prescription. If the first half of the medieval hospital day felt like a slow-motion tragedy, the second half was the encore, a drawn-out performance where everyone knew the ending, but no one dared to say it aloud. By dusk, patients had already endured prayers, broth, and perhaps the questionable intervention of a barber surgeon. Now came the quieter horrors, the ones that reveal the true legacy of these institutions. Let us start with the dying. Death was not an accident in the medieval hospital, it was an expectation. Most patients admitted were already beyond help by any medical standard. Hospitals were not designed to cure, but to house the sick poor, to offer them beds, prayers, and the chance to meet their ends surrounded by religious ritual rather than the cold street. The irony here is almost comical. An institution named for hospitality was more hospice than hospital. Even the word infirmary carried the weight of inevitability. Patients did not dream of walking out cured. They prepared for a respectable death under the watchful eyes of clergy. This obsession with death turned hospitals into rehearsal halls for the afterlife. A priest or monk might visit each bed, reminding the patient to confess sins, to focus on the salvation of the soul, to not cling to the frail vessel of flesh that was failing anyway. For some, this brought comfort. For others, it was torture. Imagine coughing your lungs out while someone insists you rehearse your final words for God day after day. Sarcasm is almost redundant here. The scene criticizes itself. The patient becomes less a person and more a spiritual project, their humanity swallowed up by ritual. Meanwhile, the hospital itself functioned as a kind of theatre of morality. Wealthy donors and civic officials saw hospitals as evidence of their charity and civic virtue. A well-funded hospital with visible patients reassured the community that the rich cared for the poor, at least in theory. But behind the facade of piety lurked systemic neglect. Supplies were often mismanaged, staff poorly trained, and conditions degrading. If the goal was to display the virtue of charity rather than to improve outcomes, then efficiency, hygiene, and even compassion could be conveniently overlooked. It is difficult not to criticize the hypocrisy. The hospital was less about the patient's survival and more about the donor's salvation. And yet, there is a grim brilliance to this setup. Medieval hospitals were remarkably effective at sustaining the social order. They reinforced the hierarchy of rich and poor, healthy and sick, blessed and damned. By treating illness as spiritual rather than physical, they absolved themselves of responsibility for failure. If a patient survived, it was a miracle. If he died, it was destiny. Either way, the institution could not be blamed. This theological insurance policy kept hospitals running for centuries without serious reform. After all, when God writes the discharge notes, who dares argue? Let's not overlook the sheer sensory detail of these places. Picture the darkness after sundown, when only candles flickered along the rows of beds. Shadows stretched across the damp stone walls, and every cough echoed like a drumbeat. The smell of sweat, infection, and urine thickened as the night grew colder. Patients lay restless, scratching at lice bites, muttering prayers, or crying softly into straw pillows. The soundscape was part liturgy, part nightmare. Even sleep offered no true escape, as fever dreams blurred with the drone of distant chanting. If you think this sounds unbearable, you're right. But here comes the kicker. For many medieval poor, the hospital was still an improvement. The streets offered no beds, no meals, no roof, and certainly no priest to whisper comfort at the hour of death. In this light, hospitals were less about healing and more about containing suffering in a controlled environment. They offered society a way to manage illness and poverty without confronting their causes. Call it medieval public health policy. Quarantine the sick, keep them out of sight, and frame the whole endeavour as charity. As centuries rolled on, hospitals began to change, but not out of sudden compassion. The Black Death of the 14th century forced a reckoning. With bodies piling faster than prayers could be said, it became obvious that ritual alone would not suffice. Slowly, medicine edged forward, guided not by faith but by observation, anatomy, and eventually the dangerous idea that maybe disease had physical causes. Hospitals, clinging to their monastic roots, resisted at first. Some collapsed altogether. Others adapted, grudgingly, into the foundations of modern medical care. By the Renaissance, hospitals began to take on a different face. Civic authorities, universities, and eventually professional physicians stepped in, replacing monks with doctors and ritual with rudimentary science. The transformation was messy, incomplete, and often resisted by those who preferred incense to instruments. Yet it marked the slow, painful birth of the hospital we recognize today. That transition did not erase centuries of misery endured within those stone walls, but it did plant the seeds of progress. The irony, of course, is that modern medicine owes part of its existence to institutions that so spectacularly failed to heal. Looking back, the medieval hospital is both a warning and a mirror. It warns us of what happens when faith, ritual, and social hierarchy are mistaken for healthcare. It mirrors our own times in uncomfortable ways. Even now, hospitals can become bureaucratic machines, where patients are reduced to numbers, where efficiency outweighs empathy, where profit masquerades as charity. The medieval patient praying under a leaking roof may not be so different from the modern patient waiting 6 hours in an overcrowded emergency ward. Different diseases, same despair. Progress, yes, but not perfection. So, why wouldn't you last a day in a medieval hospital? Because survival was never the point. These institutions were not built to cure you, but to contain you, to comfort your soul while your body wasted away, and to reassure society that something, anything, was being done about the sick. You would endure hunger, filth, ritual, neglect, and the constant reminder that your life mattered less than your afterlife. At best, you might stumble out half-healed and wholly traumatized. At worst, you would be wheeled out quietly before dawn, another soul discharged to the graveyard. And that, perhaps, is the most sobering legacy of medieval hospitals. They remind us that compassion without science is sentiment, and science without compassion is cruelty. It took centuries to marry the two, and even now the union is uneasy. The medieval hospital is gone, its stones crumbled and its prayers silenced, but the lesson remains. Healthcare is not just about keeping bodies alive, it is about refusing to let suffering become spectacle. And that, dear history lovers and insomniacs, brings us to the end of tonight's journey through the halls of a medieval hospital, a place where the ceilings soared, the chants echoed, and the incense thickened the air, yet where healing was more rumour than reality. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've survived what many in the Middle Ages did not. Here, at the Drowsy Historian, we trade in strange truths, sharp edges, and the kind of details that make you question whether progress has really been progress at all. If you enjoyed drifting through this world of dark facts and quiet sarcasm, do the modern thing the medievals never dreamed of. Click that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next midnight history lesson. Until then, sleep well, dream of cleaner hospitals, and remember, history never whispers. It snores loudly if you know how to listen. Good night from the Drowsy Historian.